We've been the past 2 weeks looking at the opening verses of the book of Jonah. My biggest challenge for this week was to choose where to go from there. I knew going in that we were not going to cover the entire book of Jonah in 3 weeks. As I mentioned that my class at my own congregation, we took 50 weeks to get through the whole book of Jonah. Yeah, we had 50 sessions. We had, yes. They're my own congregants. They have obligations. I've been the rabbi there for 34 years. They indulge me. So it wasn't an hour and a half. It was 51-hour sessions. We really did more or less a week on a verse. We spent 2 years on this. With some time off for good behavior. The congregation provides me the month of January every year for study leave, so that was my time off for good behavior. So what I've chosen to do is to go to the very end of the book of Jonah. I'm looking for some sort of sense of completion, so we're going to skip the middle verses. So I'll pass out the pages and I'll tell you what we're skipped, but imagine that you have a pretty clear sense of the general narrative of the story. So here in the fourth chapter of the book of Jonah is almost entirely a conversation between God and Jonah. God is frustrated with Jonah. Jonah, after much dispute, has, are we running out? We have more people than we had before.
We can share.
I think we have enough. We don't.
Okay.
We're okay? Okay. All right. So Jonah, rather than celebrating that the people of Nineveh have repented from their sins, Jonah is frustrated. And God is frustrated with Jonah. And Jonah says, I'm deeply grieved. And then God says to Jonah in biblical sarcasm, are you deeply grieved? And Jonah does not understand that God is speaking to him sarcastically. Jonah is so self-involved that he misses divine sarcasm. So I hope that if God ever speaks to you sarcastically, you'll be enough self-aware to recognize divine sarcasm. Jonah is thinking only about himself. So here, God is going to try to explain the point to Jonah using a kikayon plant as an object lesson. The Bible calls it a kikayon plant. We don't know what kind of plant it was. The commentators, which we're not going to look at, spend time going back and forth trying to figure out what kind of plant it is. Somebody says it's an aloe vera plant. They're back and forth. And finally, one of them says, we don't know and it doesn't matter. Which I think is true. We don't know and it doesn't matter. So I enjoy calling it the kikayon plant. So the situation for Jonah is it's hot and very sunny. It's a hot easterly wind blows. What is known in Israel today as a chamsin, using the Arabic term. Jonah suffers from this. He builds himself a hut, a sukkah, for shade. Then God causes this kikayon plant to grow, and it provides additional shade for Jonah. And he's very happy for the shade of the kikayon plant. And then the Kikayon plant exists only for one day. And then early the next morning, the Kikayon plant is felled. God sends a worm to eat the base of the Kikayon plant, and the Kikayon plant is felled. And Jonah is then deeply grieved for the Kikayon plant. So now this will take us to the beginning of chapter 4, verse 10, where we're going to start. So God says to Jonah, "You cared about the Kikayon plant for which you did not work and did not grow, which appeared in a night and perished in a night. Can I not take pity on Nineveh, that great city, for it has more than 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left, and many beasts?" God says to Jonah, "You care for this Kikayon plant. What did you do for the Kikayon plant? Nothing. What is your deep personal relationship to the Kikayon plant? It gave you shade. Did you speak to it? Did it speak to you? Does it have a will? Does it have moral judgment? It's nothing. Can't I, God, care for the city of Nineveh with 120,000 people who don't know their right hand from the left hand, and many beasts?" We'll see if we have time. We'll get to the meaning of the end. I like the meaning of the end, and we have to try to understand who the many beasts are. God is suggesting to Jonah that he can learn from the Kikayon plant. We learn from a variety of people. We learn from people who are, in a formal sense, our teachers. So imagine that you're in a class that meets every Tuesday morning. Can you imagine that? Right? And the congregation provides you with a series of teachers. Some like Rabbi Shapiro, who you've known forever, and some like me who come parachuting in from Lombard. And you're told by your local rabbi that I'm a teacher, then you take this on faith. We learn from all sorts of people. And here, God is trying to use the Kikayon plant as a teacher for Jonah. Now, God has to explain the lesson to Jonah because Jonah is a very dense student. He's not picking it up. So look at him. I have him numbered number 1 here, Abraham Ibn Ezra's comment. The text speaks in this manner so that all who hear it will know that does not the eternal labor on behalf of all of his creations. Speaking to Jonah, God asks, "And this is the reason you took pity on this thing for which you did nothing? You feel pity for this plant? How can I not take pity on all the results of my acts, all of my creatures?" So, Ibn Ezra imagines that God is getting a bit angry. God is frustrated by Jonah's inability to understand what's going on. You may have had a life experience in which things seemed crystal clear to you, and the person with whom you were engaged, speaking, did not understand it at all. If you haven't had such a life experience, please, I want to talk to you after class. You've lived a truly blessed life. Sometimes it's obvious to us, but the other person just doesn't see it. You may have, if you have children, you may have had this experience with your children when they were young and maybe even more recently. Sometimes we feel with our adult children, we see things very clearly, and it takes them longer to see the obvious, and we have to be patient enough to give them time to see the obvious. So God here is having trouble with his adult child, Jonah, who can't see the obvious. Now, Kimchi says, even though you did not take pity on the plant except because of your suffering, that Jonah does not care about the plant's death. He only cares about the fact that he doesn't have shade anymore. For him, the plant is not a living thing. For Jonah, the plant is only an object. Now, I think that as human beings, we tend to fall into a pattern of seeing the world centered around ourselves and seeing the others as objects rather than as people. So I struggled in traffic this morning to get from Glen Ellen to here. Things are a little bit clogged up on the highway for reasons that are mysterious. So I had to change lanes and stop the traffic. I'm trying to get into the next lane, and I look at the guy in the car next to me, and he looks back at me. As soon as he looked back at me, I knew he would let me in. Because I'm no longer just a Buick. I'm now a person. And he acknowledges my humanity, he has to let me in. So I think too often we just see the other object as a Buick, not as a person. And here, Jonah's not even seeing the value of the kikayon as a kikayon. He's just seeing it as a shade-giving implement to him, rather than seeing it as something having value of its own. Kimchi goes on. The God of blessing takes pity on Nineveh because of his glory, for his creatures as his glory, as it is written, the fullness of the earth is his glory. Below kol haaretz kavodo. This we're familiar with from the liturgy, from the Kedusha. And the glory of his name is from man, as it is written, whom I created for my glory, also from Isaiah. God, who created human beings, cares deeply about people. God would like Jonah to see that all people have value. But he's dealing, sadly, with Jonah, who sees value only in himself. Now, Kimchi now gives us a further lesson about the kikayon, because that Jonah did not plant the kikayon. This is a gardening tip. When a person labors for something, he will be sadder when it perishes. Even though the God of blessing did not actually labor in the forming of these creations, the Torah speaks in the language of people to bring understanding to the listeners. So that I understand the gardens that we are about to put in and labor with our hands to make grow, we will appreciate much more than the flowers we just walk by that somebody else has planted. And here, Kimchi is acknowledging that the text is speaking in human language. So, God is contrasting Jonah's attitude towards the kikayon to God's own attitude towards the people of Nineveh. And the text is arguing that God labored to create the people. Now, Kimchi is having a philosophical problem with this. What does it mean that God labored to create people? How hard did God work? Did God put on a divine Fitbit and get 10,000 steps in order to create human beings? What did God actually do to create human beings? And Kimchi can't imagine that God works in the way that we work or use energy. Or does God get tired? Well, no. In a philosophical way, we couldn't argue that God gets tired, but we do know that in the creation story, that after 6 days of creating the world, God rests. So on one level, the Torah suggests that God does indeed get tired and God rests. And I think that the author of the book of Jonah sees it in that way. Kimchi, in his medieval philosophical way, has a hard time understanding God as getting tired, so he just tells us that the text is speaking to us in human language. Okay. Now, Malbim, it's in text number 4. It's the way of the laborer to take pity on the work of his hands, not because the thing itself is any was valuable and viable. According to Rashi, the tasks included in the term of Amalta, which got the building, was plowing, planting, and watering. Sometimes we have a stronger feeling about something because we made it. If you would come to my house, you're all invited. If you're ever in Glen Ellen, stop by. And on the kitchen table, you can see a napkin holder. And it's a nice little wooden napkin holder. And it holds to be a napkin holder is a modest role in the universe. This napkin holder holds napkins perfectly. It never drops them. It's a napkin holder. Now, you would look at this napkin holder and say, it's a wooden napkin holder. But I built this napkin holder when I was in shop class in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, when I was in 7th grade. And this napkin holder was for many years was in my mother's house, and now it's returned to my house, and I am very proud of my napkin holder. And as a 13-year-old, I did not imagine that as a 65-year-old, I would still be using this napkin holder. So I take great pride in this napkin holder, and I might think this is the greatest napkin holder in all of the universe. I have not done a careful academic study of napkin holders. Just imagine they all hold napkins equally. You may have a fine napkin holder in your own homes. But my relationship to the napkin holder is because I built it. And Malbim is saying the same thing here. The Malbim is saying that which we build with our own hands, we have a special relationship with. And God is trying to explain to Jonah that God has a relationship to human beings because God created us. It's not an out there relation. Oh, look, a movable wall. Now, I come into this synagogue and say it's a fine synagogue. But I walk into congregation at Chaim. And people say, oh, I like the bima, and I'll say, my idea. I take pride. I didn't build it. I didn't build none of it with my own hands, but I did put in the sweat equity of sitting through many meetings. And some of the design, some aspects of the building did actually come from here. That which we feel that we contributed to, we have a greater sense of pride in. Okay, text number 5. So now, Ibn Ezra, if we go back to the verse says that it appeared in a night and perished in a night. Now, this is a problem. So it says it grew up Bin Lila and perished Bin Lila. So the word Lila we know is night. If we would look back at the previous verse, we would see that the worm destroyed it in the morning. So Ibn Ezra has this problem of why does the text say came in a night and it's the son of a night and it died as the son of a night, but it really died in the morning. No, I think that most people would read the 2 verses one after the other and not be bothered by this, but Abraham Ibn Ezra is precise. So he wants to help us understand the poetic image here, and he has to tell us that it's a poetic image so that we can understand it as such. Understand that it grew from the beginning of the night until the morning, and it lived for the daylight hours of one day until the evening when it fell and dried up, and completely before the dawn. That's why our text says in one night it came to be, and in one night it perished. So he's explaining exactly how the Kikayon plant died. And sometimes things around us perished. Last night I came home as having completed the 3 bar mitzvah rehearsals. We saved the Jewish people 1 13-year-old at a time. And I come home and my wife explains to me that my work is not done. That a bird has died in our yard. And that the division of labor in our household, dead birds are my category. It says in the ketubah. I did not read that part carefully, but dead birds are my category. Now, there are things for which my wife and I have different skill sets, And dead birds, no, it's not a skill set of mine. I mean, we own a shovel, we own bags. I mean, I understand what to do with the dead bird. Yes, there's a question of, can we just throw it over the fence? And, no, we quickly understood that, who knows where it fell? Maybe it bounced. It's really amazing that we don't see more dead birds, actually. Where did they go? Wait, that's another question for another time. All right. All right, so, they go up. All right, so, Jonah now, I'm sorry for the tangents, I'm the worst at this. Okay, in text number 6, Abarbanel, thank you for what you're reading. This is always embarrassing when I'm doing what I'm teaching. Oh yes, I was. A couple weeks ago, we went to the theater on a Sunday night. I turned my phone off, and its phone didn't ring for 2 days. And then finally somebody said, "Rabbi, I've been trying to call you." Really? I've been calling you on my cell phone. Why are you calling me on my cell phone? I never answer my cell phone. And then oh, it's off. Oh, look at that. There are people who are more at one with the technology than I am. Okay. Text number 6, Abarbanel. So Abarbanel is going to help us get away from the details of the language to the big picture, to the real point. And Abarbanel says, it wasn't anything about what you had previously thought. Before that night, when we questioned, Jonah had not even been aware of the Kikayon plant. That he didn't know, probably didn't know about Kikayon plants until that moment. Now, I want to suggest that the Kikayon, this one-night experience with the Kikayon plant can be important. For God is trying to use this one day of Kikayonness with Jonah's one-day encounter with the Kikayon as a turning point. God is trying to turn Jonah's perspective through the use of a plant. Because the book of Jonah ends so abruptly, we don't know whether Jonah turns or not. I mean, that's part of either the frustrating or the beautiful part of the book, depending on your point of view. But we don't know how Jonah responds to this 2-verse speech from God here at the end of the book. I want to suggest now that if we think about our own lives, there are moments, brief moments, that may have turned our lives. In a moment, I'm going to draw upon a piece of literature, not exactly biblical, but almost. But if we can think for a moment, there are, and I'm going to share one of mine with you in a second, enduring moments in our lives. And I'm not talking about weddings and birth of children. I'm not talking, but less predictable moments that, oh, because I'm here, in that moment I made a choice. And I could have gone this way, and I could have gone that way. Because I went this way, my life is gone. So we'll start out with the highest level of literature. Text number 7. So text number 7, some of you may know this by heart. This is the final scene in the film Casablanca. All right, so I love this movie. If you said, what's your favorite movie of all time? I'd be stuck between Casablanca and the Maltese Falcon. I mean, the two movies are just my absolute favorites. They're great movies. So I'll be sitting in the family room and I'm watching Casablanca, and my wife will walk in, she'll say, "Do you think it's going to end differently this time?" No. But I might see some detail in it that I haven't seen before. I don't have to worry about the narrative line. I can look at the details. All right, so Rick says to Ilsa, "We'll always have Paris. We didn't have. We lost it until you came to Casablanca. We got it back last night." Ilsa interrupts him. "And I said I would never leave you." Rick continues, "And you never will. But I've got a job to do too. Where I'm going, you can't follow. What I've got to do, you can't be any part of. Ilsa, I'm no good at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. Someday you'll understand that." As Ilsa begins to cry, Rick concludes, now, here's looking at you, kid." So Rick says he is no good at being noble, but we know quite the opposite. He's very good at being noble. It's the whole point of the whole movie, he's being noble. Now, the part that I'm most interested in is we'll always have Paris. And I think that for many of us, I recognize that most of our own lives are a little bit less romantic and dramatic than the events depicted in the movie Casablanca. Nonetheless, I think there are moments that we can think of, many of us, we can say we'll always have X. That there's a key moment in our lives that endures beyond, over the years or even over the decades, that continues to be there. In January, I was in Morocco with our JUF Rabbi's mission. Each January we go on a Rabbi's mission for the Jewish United Fund, usually to go someplace in the former Soviet sphere, but this year we were in Morocco. We went to visit with the Jews of Morocco. When we got to Casablanca, everybody was very into this movie. Everybody was doing lines for this movie. I am happy to report to you that the tourist industry in Casablanca is strong, and there is now a Rick's Cafe American in Casablanca, patterned after the movie, so that the life can imitate art. I want to share with you a story from my own life, that in June of, what I wrote you the first line of the story here in the text. So in June of 1969, I had unsuccessfully completed a year as a student at the University of Minnesota, my freshman year. I had missed out on one of the cardinal obligations of being a student, going to class.
Party boy, huh?
In every year around Thanksgiving, when college students from the congregation appear home for their first big visit, I always ask them, "Are you going to class?" And they always think it's a joke, and I'm doing penance. I really mean it. So after 2 quarters of not going to class at the University of Minnesota, I flunked out. I thought I was a clever guy, but it turns out you have to go to class in order to pass courses. So I appeared, my parents in the meantime had moved from Minnesota to Northern California. So they ran away from home and went to San Francisco at a time when many people were going to San Francisco, but the generations were the other way around in our family. So they went to San Francisco. So in June of 1969, I arrived in their home in California to visit with no real future. I had a job for the summer at the Habunim camp in Three Rivers, Michigan, where I had been a camper previously, Habunim Camp Tavor, and I was going to go there for the summer, and what I was going to do afterwards, I did not know. Also, I was about to lose my student deferment, and Richard Milhouse Nixon had plans what he wanted to do with me. So this was a very uncertain time in my life. So one day I borrowed my mother's car and I went over the mountains to the beach, to San Gregorio Beach. My mother still lives there in Los Altos. So I went over the mountains to the beach, and there on the parking lot of the beach was a school bus painted in all sorts of psychedelic colors. And this was a group of people called the Hog Farm. And I chatted with them, and I went with them to get some food, and I learned what dumpster diving was. I never heard that expression before then. And I helped them gather food, and then we had a good time. I had a good time with them, and they were on their way from California to upstate New York to handle the food for a rock festival that was going to be in New York that summer. A place called Woodstock. So they said to me, "Why don't you come with us?" Now, why wouldn't I go with them? What was my future? Did I really need a mailing address to get my draft notice? And for me, there was I could have left my mother's car sitting right there in the parking lot, got on this psychedelic school bus, and gone off for great adventures across America. I didn't. I eventually ended up back in college and rabbinic school, and here I am today with so much cattle. But there was this dramatic moment where I had to make a decision to go this way or that way. Now, sitting where I'm sitting now, it might seem inevitable that I made the choice that I made. But at that moment, it was not inevitable. I could easily have chosen to go the other direction. And there's lots of times, I think, in our own lives as individuals and in the lives of nations where big decisions are made. Looking back at them, they seem to be inevitable, but they're not. I bring you the example in my text number 9. Of the June 28th of 1914 in Sarajevo, where Gavrilo Princips assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, I'm sure that all of you love nothing more than the history of World War I, but even if you don't, I'm going to bother you with it a little bit. So, in reaction to this assassination, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia. They didn't have to. They decided to do so. Looking back, one of the questions that historians ask about World War I is, did it have to be? Some people argue that it was inevitable. I disagree with that position strongly. I think a series of decisions were made by human beings, any one of which could have been made differently, and World War I would not have unfolded in the way in which it unfolded. So, the Austro-Hungarian leadership, Franz Josef, the emperor, the uncle of Franz Ferdinand, felt an obligation to declare war on Serbia. The voice for moderation in the Austro-Hungarian leadership was Franz Ferdinand, who is now dead. He wasn't there to oppose his uncle, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire went to war. The Russian Empire felt an obligation to come in on behalf of Serbia. They didn't have to, but for, I think, Russian political reasons, they decided to. Germany felt an obligation to come in on behalf of the Austro-Hungarians, and then the French came in with the Russians, and the British eventually, after the Germans invaded through Belgium, came in on the side of the French, and before the end of time, the United States of America joined in as well. None of this was necessary. It was decisions made by individuals, by regular human beings, that led to this war that accomplished nothing. But it was individual decisions. So what I want to say is that we have a lot of power in our individual decision making. that we all have power, and the question is, for us, is how do we use that power? Now, fortunately, none of us are in charge of great European empires, and we don't have, when we make poor decisions, nobody goes to war and millions of people don't get killed. But we have individual decision-making power all the time, and we use it for the better, or we use it for the worse, and it's up to us to decide how to use that power, and we get to decide what's going to happen. There are without getting over dramatic, our lives are like that of the Kikayom plant. We come in the night and we perish in the night. As it says in the Psalms, we grow up like grass and we perish like grass. We know there was a date before which we weren't here, and there's a date after which we no longer will be here. And the question is, what are we doing while we're here? That's the question. What do we leave behind us when we're gone? This confrontation with my parents in June of 1969 did not go well. They weren't pleased with me. My parents and I didn't speak to each other for 5 months. There was no cell phones in 1969. Finding me was a little bit of a difficulty. After summer camp, I ended up here in Chicago. I lived in a Bayit Habunim house in Hyde Park. Everybody else was going to the University of Chicago, and I was doing nothing. I wrote poetry. It was 1969. I was 19 years old. I wrote poetry. And enjoyed it. Pardon?
So that's what you did in Hyde Park.
Well, no, I enjoyed
I
enjoyed the adventure. I went to anti-war rallies downtown. There was no L growing up in Minneapolis. I mean, I was enjoying the big city stuff quite a bit, but getting nowhere. And eventually, it's a long story, but eventually I chose to go back to college. Good things happened. Now, 24 years ago, my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And I knew enough to know this is not something that people generally survive. And sadly, in my father's case, as in most cases, it was caught very late. And he was diagnosed in December, and I went to California to visit with him and my mother. Then in March, I wanted to go visit with him again, and I had an idea that my father was a lifelong baseball fan, and I'm an enthusiastic baseball fan, and I suggested to my father that we should go to spring training together, that we should meet in Arizona, if he was up to it. So he decided he was, and we met in Arizona. We spent the several days in Arizona, going to ball games in the afternoon, and talking the rest of the time. So it's the only trip my dad and I ever took, just the two of us. Really, I think it was probably the only time that he and I, we were just the two of us were together. And growing up as a kid, it was always my mother, my brother, my sister, it was always the family. It was never just the two of us. We reflected on lots of things during that week, and one night over dinner, I tried to apologize to him for being such a jerk when I was 19. And I was. And he said to me, "Oh, it wasn't so bad. He just forgave me." Now, it wasn't because I deserved to be forgiven. It was because of his forgiving nature. He easily could have said to me, "Stephen, you were just an unbelievable jerky." And he could have used more colorful language than that. But that wasn't what he wanted to do, and it wasn't the choice that he wanted to make. He had different ideas about things. And he had ideas that he wanted to convey to me. My daughter, who lives here in Deerfield, and when her son was born, she understood that it was going to be important to me that her son be named after my dad. I'm named after my mother's father. My mother's father died when my mother was in high school, so he was Simcha and I'm Simcha. And my father was Aharon Ephraim, and it was going to be important to me that Lisa and Jason named their son Aharon Ephraim. Now, I understood they weren't going to name him my father's English name. There aren't too many little boys walking around in Deerfield today named Fred. Fred was not going to be his name. So he's Ethan. It's a much better 21st century name for a little boy. But I know that that he carries my father's name. When I walk into my mother's house in California, there's a wedding photograph of my grandparents, my mother's parents. A very formal picture of my grandmother sitting in a chair and my grandfather standing behind her. And I look at this picture, I know I'm carrying his name, I look at this picture, and I say to him, how am I doing? I'm carrying his name, and I wonder what he would think of me. Am I bringing credit to his name? How am I doing? I think that we're connected. I said a moment ago that we're very temporary. But I think that we need to understand ourselves as connected vertically through time to those who came before us and to those who come after us. Those who came before us biologically and also in other ways as well. That I think that I'm a continuation of my parents. I think I'm also a continuation of my teachers. There's our text, number 12. I'd like you to look at that with me. We are connected vertically through time to those who came before us and those who come after us. The Talmud, in Yevamot 97a, tells us that when we repeat the words of our teachers, their lips move in their graves. I love this. I feel the way about my teachers who taught me face to face, and those I've encountered only through their written words. I know that when I quote Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Kimchi, Abarbanel, and Malbim, I cause their lips to move in their graves. So, all right, I've been talking for 45 minutes. Let me stop for a minute. Comments, questions, challenges, disagreements? Yes?
I'm a firm believer that if you don't take the road that you want to take, you're going to look back at it and regret it. So I decided that I'd fulfill what I wanted to do after I was divorced, and I moved to Jerusalem and lived there for almost 2 years and loved every minute of it, and then had to come home for family reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And like Rick, and Ilsa, I was devastated that I had to leave Jerusalem. And an Israeli woman who worked at Hebrew College, as a matter of fact, when I was telling her about my distress about having to leave, she said, Cindy, Jerusalem is like your mother. You don't have to live with her to love her. And that was the most, obviously it was like 25 years, the most comforting thing someone could have said to me. Like, you'll always have Jerusalem.
That's right, yes.
You'll always be there. And so when you read, when we were looking at that, that's what came to my mind.
Yes.
Yeah. I wasn't here, that was my first time coming. Did you talk about the use of this piece on Yom Kippur afternoon?
Yes.
Could you repeat that, please?
So the question is about, did I talk about its use on Yom Kippur afternoon? And yes, I mean, I can simply say that it's about forgiveness. And that's why it's on Yom Kippur. I think there's lots more in it. Obviously, I think there's lots more in it.
I asked for that.
Yes, but I think that at least for the ancient rabbis, it's about forgiveness. Because then Jonah gets forgiven by God, and the people of Nineveh get forgiven by God, and we hope that we're going to get forgiven by God too. Other comments and questions? All right, we'll go on. All right, so let's just take a quick minute and look back up at the verse. And we're going to go back to page 1 just for a sec. So I want to look at the second half of what's here, really the end of what's here. So the commentators are now going to look at this question of 120,000 people who don't know their right from their left, and many beasts as well. All right, now, before we look at what the commentators have to say, what do you see there? When it says 120,000 people don't know their right hand from the left hand, and many beasts as well. What does that say to you? Yes?
They're not very bright. They don't know what they're doing. And there are many innocents. Beasts are innocent.
All right, so they don't know what they're doing, they're innocent? Yeah.
But they're important because he counted them.
Yes, we know that, yes, thank you. Yes, God counts them. He says 120,000 of them. They're worthwhile counting. They're not just... they're not nothing, as they say. Yes?
My aunt has a saying, you can't kick a dog for being stupid. They needed to be forgiven just because they didn't know what they were doing.
Yes, we can't criticize a child for being a child. But, when parents bring a newborn for a naming as part of Friday night services, I tell them if their child starts crying during the actual naming ceremony, I'll talk louder. I don't expect infants to have moral judgment. The bar mitzvah kids, I expect to have moral judgments. That's what we're celebrating, but not the infants. All right, so we can't expect them to be other than who they are. Yes.
They weren't Jewish.
So they're not Jewish, which is one of the ongoing questions here is how does that affect their status? We spoke about this in previous lessons, last week in particular, about how do we look at people other than our own group. This, I believe, is the most interesting religious question of our time, is how do we look at people of religions other than our own? I think that as Jews, oftentimes we're very concerned that other religions should have proper respect for our religion, and that people of other religions, mostly Christians, should have respect and understand what Judaism is. I think, on the other hand, most Jews have very little understanding of Christianity. I think that, I don't know what the story is here, but I think in my own congregation, that the understanding of Christian scripture is quite limited. I teach Introduction to the Bible at Elmhurst College. Did I tell you about this?
No.
So Elmhurst College is a United Church of Christ college. I teach in the Religious Studies department, so I teach Introduction to Bible there. So it's Introduction to Bible as understood by Christians. So I teach the Jewish scripture and I teach the Christian scripture. So if you came to my class at Elmhurst College tomorrow evening, you would hear me teaching my Christian students about the gospel according to Mark. Now, the fact that the UCC affiliated college can have a rabbi teaching the gospels says something significant about what's going on in America today. That they trust me, and they trust that I will teach this in a proper academic way. I think that we should understand them if we're expecting them to understand us. And that Jews should know about the subtleties and nuances here rather than just saying it's them, or describing using the academic term Nourishkeit. It's not Nourishkeit, it's their religion, and we should understand their religion. We don't have to believe in their religion. I'm opposed to Jews becoming Christians. We should remain Jewish. I'll raise my right hand. You can quote me. I think Jews should remain Jewish. but we should understand the religions of the other people around us. Okay, so the Ninevites may be not knowing their right hand from the left hand because they're not Jewish. That's one of the possibilities. And that's going to be sort of raised in the commentaries as well. All right, let's look at what the commentators have to say here. So we're on text 13. God says to Jonah, "And in Nineveh is the work of my hands, of which to be proud between its size and the strength. It's not a kikayon plant. For behold, it has many, more than 120,000 people. And it's more appropriate to take pity on them. And you cannot say that you do not pity the kikayon plant in its passing when the worm arrived near you to destroy it, or it brought you shade. And what did I receive from Nineveh? Its great name, which is like the shade that the plant brought you. And if you say they practiced idol worship and did not repent from it, I say they are like human beings who do not speak, for they do not have Torah and are not commanded by it. And there is a portion of Hashem, God, and the host of heavens for all nations. And because of this, it is not appropriate to punish them." So God says to the Abarbanel imagines God and Jonah going back and forth. And Abarbanel in his commentary earlier is very strong on portraying the people of Nineveh as idol worshippers. You might recall that Ibn Ezra says they were not idol worshippers, so there's a disagreement between Ibn Ezra and Abarbanel on this question. But Abarbanel, even though he's saying they're idol worshippers, he's saying they're not nothing. That God has a portion of God's presence for all the nations. Now, it's important to understand who Abarbanel is in his saying this. Abarbanel grew up in Spain. Abarbanel is a leader of the Spanish Jewish community. He grew up actually in Portugal, then Spain. He's a leader of the Jewish community of Spain. And at the time of the Jews being expelled from Spain, Abarbanel was an advisor to the king and queen. He was negotiating on behalf of the Jewish community to try to prevent the expulsion from Spain. So Abarbanel felt quite personally the disappointment, anger, and pain of the power of the other. Nonetheless, he still says there's a part of the portion of God's for them. He is not completely disparaging of her most Christian majesties. He still says we can't dismiss them. They're somebody. Even though they have done awful things to us, they are still somebody. Now, Ibn Ezra now is going to look at the question of this question of right and left. So he says the 120,000. What does 120,000 refer to? He says it's the number of people who had not sinned, meaning children. And also in the city are innocent animals. The two categories of beings, young children and animals, could not be expected to have moral judgment. Yet they would have been destroyed with the rest of the city. For in this way, we must reason understand. Its destruction would have been complete, like the destruction of Sodom, destroying every living thing. This matter is known in all the world. So he is saying that the 120,000 who don't know their right from their left are the children. That Ibn Ezra is saying this does not refer to the whole population of Nineveh, it just refers to the children of Nineveh. The children of Nineveh are the ones who don't know the right from their left, and the animals. And that the animals have no moral judgment. You know, we can say bad dog, but we don't. I think that the dog is evil. It's just chewed on something it shouldn't chew on. But the animals of Nineveh shouldn't be destroyed for the sins of the adults, and the children of Nineveh shouldn't be destroyed for the sins of the adults. That's Ibn Ezra's read. Kimchi, we'll skip the Kimchi, it's too obscure. Rashi, text number 16, says the children are too young to have yet learned the distinction between right and left. Now Rashi says large animals refers to grown adults, whose thinking is like that of animals who don't know who created them. I like the Rashi here, so he is helping us understand that much cattle, referred to much cattle for Rashi, is a metaphor, not a concern for the future farmers of Nineveh here. That it's 120,000 children and the adults. That's how Rashi would read it. The adults are like beasts, filled to Chaim. The adults are the beasts who shouldn't be punished for being beasts. The children shouldn't be punished for being children, and the adults shouldn't be punished for being who they are because they can't help it. It's just that they grew up of that nation. He's saying that we should have pity on them. They can't do any better than they're doing. We can't expect them to be like us. Okay. Kimsey says, goes back to the children who don't know their right from their left, and they have no sin and deserve no punishment except on the account of their parents. Because the parents repented, the children are without punishment. Let me turn my notes. Okay. Abarbanel is going to take a different approach. Abarbanel says that God does not say this in reference to infants, as the other interpreters have said, but for this condemned city, the infants were judged for the sins of their parents. They are like limbs of the adults, and their fate is the fate of the adults of the city. And he says this about the population in Nineveh in general. For in the city there are more than 120,000 people without the benefits of the teaching of the Torah. So in the matter of idol worship, they do not know their right from their left. So he's saying, as we saw before, that he's not going to blame them for being idol worshippers. They can't help it. They don't have the benefit of Torah, so we can't help that they practice idol worship. There are generations before us, or even we can look back at our own childhood, where people did things that they shouldn't have done, that we now know they shouldn't have done then. When I was a child, we went on long family trips in our station wagon. Did I sit in a seat with a seat belt? No. We rolled around the back of the station wagon, yes. My son, my son and daughter-in-law and infant granddaughter came for Pesach from Colorado Springs, and I'm going to go pick them up at the airport. So the question is, am I bringing the right car seat? Because if I don't bring the right car seat, we'll have to spend the entire Seder at Midway Airport because they couldn't get in the car without the right car seat. And my stories of rolling around the back of the station wagon as a child is not going to move them to put Kira in the wrong car seat. And ultimately, the decision was they would bring their car seat from Colorado, because how could I, in Chicago, possibly know anything about car seats? Living in this backward place. At the Habonim camp that I mentioned before, we would I remember we would go on these great trips from the Habonim camp. And how did we get from place to place? Well, the camp had a flatbed truck. And we sat in the back of the flatbed truck and bounced around as it bounced on the rural roads. Now, I loved this. Loved this. But if I would go to my friend Jerry Kay this summer and say, well, we don't need a bus to take the Holocene campers on the canoe trip. We'll just take them on a flatbed truck. I'm sure Joe can get us a flatbed truck. And we'll just pile the kids in the back of the truck. It'll be a lot of fun. And people would just assume I was joking. And people would not even think. The question is whether a school bus is safe enough or not, or whether we need a tank-like bus. But the question of what is acceptable behavior, it changes over time. And there are other factors that are and I'm certainly not suggesting that here in 2015 that we should go back to the safety positions of 1956. No, I'm happier that we indeed have seat belts and don't use flatbed trucks to transport kids, and people have given up smoking more or less, and there's lots of, I'm all in favor. Yes, I didn't, when I have health issues, I don't say, oh, I'd like to go find a doctor who practices 19th century medicine. That'd be, no, or I want doctors who treated at Barbanel, I want 15th century medicine. No, I'm happy with 21st century medicine and all those good things. Okay. All right, Malbim. For the Ninevites do not have the knowledge to distinguish between the worship of the special God represented by the right hand, as is written, from his right hand will not move. I'm always with you, you held my right hand, from Psalms. And the worship of the left, which is the worship of nature and the array of heavenly bodies, which are connected to the left side. They should not be punished because of their lack of knowledge. And from this we receive an answer also concerning the punishment of Israel. For they already learned the difference between right and left, for they received the Torah, containing the knowledge of God and the true faith. And they are appropriately punished for any idolatrous worship they perform. The people of Nineveh are not punished for this. God explains to Jonah that the Ninevites deserve mercy because they are not in an advanced society. Malbim, I think, is taking a we are better than them approach. Yes, and so Malbim is not medieval. Malbim lived in the 19th century, and he's still taking a we're better than them approach. Okay. Let's look at this next, just comment number 21, which is mine. While the commentators differ in how they assign specific concrete meanings to the metaphors the text uses to describe the Ninevites, they all agree that God is telling Jonah that the Ninevites need to be taken seriously as human beings. They have intrinsic value simply because they are people. I would add that the text in the original Hebrew uses singular forms. It's always interesting to me when I find something to comment on that none of the commentators ever addressed. You know, there are hundreds and hundreds of years of commentary have looked at the text, and yet I still find things that nobody else spoke about. Lo yada ben yamino l'smolo, who does not know his right hand from his left hand, refers to each of the Ninevites, emphasizing their individual worth. That's my comment. But to those of you who know Hebrew can see it's this yamino smolo, which is in the singular. Okay. Many of you are familiar with the halacha verse that I bring here. Do we not have one Father? Did not one God create us all? Earlier I suggested that we were all connected vertically over time to those who came before us and those who come after us, our parents and our teachers and our children and our students. I think we're also connected horizontally to the other human beings who are alive today. We tell the story of Adam and Eve. We continue to tell the story of Adam and Eve. I don't believe that there ever was an Adam and Eve. One of my friends is a Bible professor at Wheaton College, told me that some years ago a new president took over at Wheaton College, and he was concerned that the Bible faculty at Wheaton College was getting too liberal. and it's an evangelical school, but even within the evangelical world, there are more liberal and more conservative evangelicals. And he came to the Bible department and wanted them all to pledge that they believe that God created Adam and Eve. And there was much uproar in the Bible department over this question, and they finally agreed to the following. We believe that God created Adam and Eve, whatever that means. So I believe that God created Adam and Eve, whatever that means. Yeah, so if you can throw in the phrase, whatever that means, it gives you a little bit more wiggle room. So I would understand it's important to tell the Adam and Eve story, but I want to use it metaphorically rather than use it literally. So I do want to say that we're all descendants from the same origins. That I do not want to argue that we are superior to any other category of human beings, nor are we inferior to any other category of human beings. I want to argue that we were all created by the same God. I think that as human beings, we need community. That having community, is being connected horizontally to other people, is essential to us. That we need to have other human beings with whom we are in relationship. That being part of a community is crucial to leading a meaningful life. I think that people who have a sense of community are strengthened by that sense of community, and those people who become isolated are damaged by this isolation. And that community, it's going to be a great shock that I think that synagogues should be a source of this sense of community, and that healthy congregations should provide this sense of community. That we are part of something larger than ourselves. The book of Jonah ends abruptly. We don't know what Jonah says back to God. How is Jonah going to respond to the lessons that God is teaching? So how do you imagine that Jonah would respond back to God? So God says to Jonah, how can I destroy Nineveh? There's 120,000 people who don't know the right hand from the left hand, and much cattle. And what does Jonah say? What do you think Jonah says? What do you think happens to Jonah after this? In the news a few months ago, there was a report that the ISIS people had destroyed the tomb of Jonah. So many people, members of the congregation, and people, friends from across the country, all sent me this news story that the grave of Jonah had been destroyed. And so this was a conversation. Did I really imagine that Jonah stayed there in Nineveh? That he made Aliyah to Nineveh? So I was happy to assure everybody that I don't know who's buried in the grave of Jonah, but I'm really sure it's not Jonah. It's not Jonah. Yes?
If Jonah listened to God before and did go to Nineveh, I think there's no reason to suppose that he took what God said to heart and moved on and realized there was something more important than him.
Okay. Do you think yes, go ahead.
What you mean? He might respond to God, okay, you can do that because you're God. I'm not God. And so I don't have to be as accepting as you are. I don't control the universe. I'm just...
So, yeah, so we can't imagine Jonah remaining small. I mean, certainly we can imagine Jonah remaining small. Or we can imagine Jonah growing as a result of this experience. Those are, I think there are both possibilities. The text is open. The text doesn't tell us. So I can't tell you I can't give you the right answer here. My book of Jonah ends exactly where your book of Jonah ends, without the satisfying conclusion. Sometimes in recent years, TV shows with complicated, twisty plots have become quite popular. And sometimes the twistier the plot, the more intriguing it gets, or the more confusing it gets. And there's a show now called Dig. Have any of you seen this? Yeah, so it doesn't matter if you haven't. I have a neutral opinion on the show, but my wife and I have gotten hooked into watching it. So,
With the red heifer.
yeah, with the red heifer. Yes, yes. The other night, I said, and what I said was, this better have a payoff. There better be a, if they don't resolve all those complicated, clever plot twists and turns, I'm going to feel cheated. It should have a resolution. When the stories don't have resolution, then it's frustrating. Yes.
Am I missing something? God sends Jonah. Jonah doesn't want to go. Then he concedes and he goes. What was Jonah's mission once he got there? I mean, I think that's central to the argument.
So,
how is Jonah going to transform these people if God's not going to help him?
So, Jonah, the book of Jonah could be 2 chapters long, or it could end, or it certainly could be 3 chapters long. It could end after the people of Nineveh repent for their sins. And that could be the end. Jonah goes, Jonah says in 40 days Nineveh will be destroyed. In chapter 3, the people repent for their sins. That's a horror. That could be the end of the book. But there isn't. There's this 4th chapter in which God deals with Jonah's frustration. Jonah could see himself as successful. Jonah could go back to the kingdom of Israel and say, God sent me to Nineveh, and I spoke for God at Nineveh, and the people of Nineveh responded to my prophecy, and I am the most successful prophet who ever lived. I'm the only one who people ever listened to. I belong in the Prophet Hall of Fame. I will pose for my statue now. That could be the end. But no, he doesn't see it that way. He can't accept success. He's angry that God forgave the people of Nineveh. It bothers him that God forgave the people of Nineveh. He can't see the big picture at all. He sees only the small picture, which I think for me is the real problem with Jonah as a person. For me, it's the whole lesson of the story. Is that I think the push at the end of the 4th chapter is for us to see ourselves as part of the big picture. That if I look at the whole world only in terms of myself, it's pretty small. But if I look at the world in terms of bigger things, I'm connected in all sorts of ways. I'm going to be retiring from my position as senior rabbi of congregation at Chaim in a year. And it's been publicly announced that my successor has been selected. Our associate rabbi is going to succeed me. And people are asking me, so what are you going to do when you retire? So it's a fine question, and it's a question for which I have lots of answers. And I have all sorts of ideas about what I'm going to do when I retire. And part of it is there's all sorts of projects I'm involved in sort of now, but my work gets in the way. My obligation to the congregation at Chaim interrupts all my other side projects, which I hope to devote more time to, but I'm not going to spend all my time eating brunch and playing golf. I like playing golf, but in moderation. I have all sorts of things I'm going to do, but they're all involved with other people and other projects, and a lot of Save the World stuff, some things that are just are fun for me, would work on things like that, but here. Do I have a minute? Yes. At the APAC conference in March, I went to all these sessions in Washington. I went to all these sessions about all these political sessions that I enjoy all the politics. And When I go to APAC, I get to be one of the minority opinion there, which is just fine with me. And people, you're one of those Obama guys. Just fine. I'm happy. So they went to, one afternoon, I went to a session called Brew and White. So Brew and White was about Israeli craft breweries, about the craft beer industry in Israel. And we learned about that craft brewing is now a thing in Israel. That in Israel, it used to be if you got a beer in Israel, it was a Gold Star or some or a Maccabi, but nothing special. And now in Israel, there is quality beer. I was in Israel a year and a half ago, and I sat down someplace and asked for a Gold Star. The bartender said, you know, you should have a Malka, it's much better. A Malka? Okay, fine, who knew? So I had a Malka, and he was absolutely right. It wasn't just goods for Israel. It was like, oh, it has character, it has taste. You know, this could come from Ireland. This is a good beer. And so, at the session on Brew and White, so there was these two guys from Israel talking about the different craft breweries in Israel, and people were asking all sorts of technical questions about beer brewing that were over my head. And finally, I raised my hand and said to these guys, "How can we help you?" So there's a fellow who's the distributor of these Israeli craft beers in America, and it happens that one of the states they're selling in is Illinois. And I said to him, you know, that there are people interested in buying Israeli products and would be willing to try Israeli beer just because it's Israeli beer, not just because. And we could have them. So I am now corresponding with this guy who's coming here in May. I'm going to meet with him about talking about beer tasting in synagogues in Chicago. So I have a new retirement project. Now, is this an important? Am I going to save the world by encouraging people to drink quality Israeli beer? No, but it's something extra fun to do that is also helping the Jewish state in my modest little way. I think that I had to convince the guy, I'm not sure he's 100% yet convinced that I'm not looking at the angle here that I'm looking to make money on this. Well, he can be the businessman, I can just be the rabbi encouraging the project. I think our lives grow when we realize that we're not alone. And I think that Jonah's, excuse the expression, cardinal sin is that he sees himself as being alone. He's not connected to God in a positive way, even though God speaks to him. And I don't think he's connected to the people of his own time. He's not connected to the prophetic tradition. I think he sees himself as a single human being disconnected. And I think the lesson from the book of Jonah for us is to see ourselves as connected to the people who came before us, and to the people who came after us. I think many of us feel a connection to the people who came before us. Many people, my mother will tell stories about her mother. When I'm talking to my mother, she'll say, well, your Nana says, as if she talked to my grandmother yesterday. I have to sit and figure out when my grandmother died, but it's at least 30 years ago. But my mother talks about her own mother as if she just spoke to her. I talk about my dad to my children who never really knew him as if he's an ongoing part of their lives. My daughter, who lives here, wants me to teach her children how to keep score at the ball game. My dad taught me how to keep score at the ball game. Now, is keeping score at the ball game important? What is in our family? And I don't care about the electronic scoreboard. I care about keeping score with a pencil on the 4-3. I know what that means. But there's ways of making our lives not just that the isolated individual, but that is being connected to more than we are. So I brought text 23 as my favorite text in the Bible. And it also suggests that we're not, beyond being connected to other human beings, we're also connected to God. We read this section from Deuteronomy on Yom Kippur. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. The Word of God is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach. It's not in the heavens that you should say, who will go up to the heaven for us and get us, and make us hear it, that we may observe it. Nor is it beyond the sea that we should say, who will come across the sea for us and get it for us, and make us hear it, that we may observe it. The Word of the God is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. Beficha uvilvavecha lasoto. In your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. So, for me, I feel connected to God. I feel connected to the Word of God. I feel connected to the Word of God whenever I'm studying the text. Now, I know that as Jews, some of us are drawn to God through prayer. Some of us are drawn to God through doing deeds of loving kindness. And some of us are drawn to God through study. I think there's 3 paths to draw closer to God. All 3 can draw us closer to God. I'm happily engaged in prayer, in study, and doing good deeds. I find all 3 draw me closer to God. For me, studying these commentaries to Jonah do the trick. When I sit down with my teachers, I know their lips move, and I know that I'm drawn closer to God. Thank you.